Hello, and welcome to PJFM in Conversation. My name is Gary Kramer. I'm a film critic for Salon.com and the Philadelphia Gay News, among other publications. It is my pleasure to speak with director Kaveh Nabatian about his new film, SIN La Habana, playing this season at the Philadelphia Jewish Film Festival. Kaveh, thank you so much for joining us. Congratulations on your film. SIN La Habana to me is a very sensual and very atmospheric film. I feel the grittiness of Cuba, the brightness, the rain, the blackouts. I feel the chill in Montreal. I get the textures of Leonardo's dance and Nassim making a stained glass. Can you talk about your approach to the storytelling? Because it's very impressionistic and it's very immersive. And I think that's what draws me in.
Well, those are great words to describe it. I'm glad it did that. I mean, I guess I'm always interested in a kind of sensorial, immersive kind of filmmaking where you learn as much about the story from textures and glances as from the words that are being spoken. And so texture is not only in the way, like whether we're shooting on digital or 16 millimeter or what kind of lenses, but then in this film, I was also really playing with actual textures, like the idea of glass, which is this hard yet brittle, substance that can cut you, but can also break really easily, which I felt like was kind of an interesting metaphor for what some of the characters are going through. And then you're also got like blood in there and gauze. And so I was trying to just kind of, tell the story through layers of texture and sonic texture and visual texture, as much as trying to have a decent script.
Well, your film is very stylized. You've got black and white scenes. You've got dance in slow motion. You've got memories and flashbacks that are fragmented, which goes back to your glass metaphor. There are video clips. There's performances. There's rituals. There are all these sort of narrative curly cues, I'll call them. Can you talk about creating the film's style? Because I think, again, it's this immersive sort of impressionistic approach. We learn about the characters and we get to piece them together as opposed to being told who they are, what they're about, what their goals are. They all have agendas and yet they come slowly to life rather than, being all told and hit you over the head with them. And I think that makes you a very active participant as a viewer. And I like that about your film.
Oh, great. I love everything you're saying. This is wonderful. I have a background in music. I'm a musician. That's my other job. And I've also, I've made a lot of music videos as well as a lot of experimental films where we really kind of dug into the idea of texture and sound. And so in terms of like a narrative approach, it's really a matter of it's partly a matter of with every scene trying to think formally what the best way of telling it is in terms of, the lighting and the sound and obviously the acting. And also like whether we're shooting it on film or on digital, but it's not just that. It was also that I knew that the energy of Cuba and the heat of Cuba was something that had to be really present in the film. And so, exactly, yeah. And so, some of that is in the sound design for sure, but also a lot of it is in the way we shot it. And so it was a conversation with the producers from the beginning where I was like, you have to give me some time to just shoot stuff that doesn't necessarily seem like it's directly related, but it's going to work. And so, I also have a background in documentary. So like, if it starts raining, it's like, okay, guys, we got to stop. We got to go shoot her with a yellow umbrella walking down the street because we might not get this again. And so at first it took a little bit of it took a bit of figuring out, to figure out how we do that when people are more used to a more traditional, these are the number of pages we shoot this day. This is our shot list, and and we stick to it. There's some of that for sure, but there's also some times where okay, we're going out with my Bolex. Give me half a day, and you got to give me time for that. Me and the DP are going to go, and we're going to go to this river. We're going to go to this place. These places that I know Havana well enough, and I know Montreal enough to where I can capture the kind of textures and sensations that I wanted to. And so I just made sure to get that into the schedule. And then in post-production, it was interesting talking to the editor who also has edited Denis Coté films, which are, he shoots one movie a year, and they're so perfectly, he knows exactly what he wants. Mm-hmm. And his last feature film, he edited it in 4 days, So that's the polar opposite of me, because I've got all this kind of material, and it's a matter of exploring things and then finding out this doesn't work and that works, and then putting it together. And
and that's the impressionistic approach. I mean, you're basically creating this sort of sensual, sort of sound and texture and image. You use light very deliberately. You use color very deliberately. That's why I'm saying you feel so much of that in the first half of the movie that when it shifts to Canada, you have a totally different feel and a totally different tone and texture. Let's talk about the adaptation of the story. It's a cross-cultural drama, and I love films like that, and I love films that present characters that I don't get to see in everyday life. You show Iranian Jewish characters that are very not uncommon to see on screen. You show Cuban characters, and give us a sense of Cuba, which is a place most Americans have not been to yet. Is opening up. Can you talk about this cross-cultural appreciation?
Yeah, I didn't really realize it until the movie was done, but I mean, I'm the product of a cross-cultural relationship. My mother's American, kind of WASP, and my dad's an Iranian Jew. So I grew up kind of like straddling different cultures, and I grew up in Canada, so that was even a third culture. It's not so different from the US, but it is actually quite different. So
it's different.
yeah, so I grew up kind of like learning how to jump from one, way of speaking and way of acting to another, and how people deal with situations differently. And so I've always been fascinated by that. And I think partly because I've never felt like a really solid sense of home, I've really always been interested in how people, like what home means to different people, and the idea of leaving home, and the idea of, like the rituals that create a home.
And I definitely have a question about rituals.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, the Afro-Cuban thing for my writing partner, Pablo Herrera, it was really important for him to have a really, authentic is kind of a loaded word, but to have an honest portrayal of Afro-Cuban culture, because often when foreigners shoot in Cuba, the Afro-Cuban culture, it becomes this very kind of exoticized and unreal thing. And even within Cuban culture, you don't see that Cuban cinema, you don't see that much of Afro-Cuban culture portrayed in a kind of honest way. So that was really important to him, and having Pablo at my side while we were writing made it possible, and also working with Cuban actors. And then for the Iranian Jewish stuff, like the father in the film is actually played by my father, the mother is my aunt, and so we were able to, it was easy to find. I mean, it's a culture that they know super well, and I know super well.
Well, let's talk about the integration themes, because there's some very interesting ethical and legal issues that are presented in the film, from sex tourism to fake marriages for Cubans to escape their homeland, to the other ideas that I don't want to spoil for people who haven't seen it yet. Can you talk about incorporating those themes in your film? Because, I always think of Cubans, wanting to escape, and yet there's such an interest in the culture and the country that you sort of show us why they want to leave, but at the same rate, you make their life there so interesting.
So people talk about Cuba as this golden prison where people generally have enough to eat, people are literate, there's high level of education, free, decent healthcare, and all this stuff. And especially when compared to other Caribbean countries, there's a lot going on in Cuba. But what happens is when you give people all that, and then you never let them leave, and you don't give them the financial or the legal means to even visit another country, it becomes this place that feels like this golden prison. And so especially for people who have a talent and they're butting up a glass ceiling within Cuba, there's this feeling of being really, really stuck. And so I wanted to show the character of Leonardo, he loves Cuba and he misses Cuba. And I try to show that when he's in Montreal through the 16mm flashbacks, and try to inject that heat of Cuba back into his life in Montreal. But at the same time, he knows that he can't fulfill his destiny or fulfill his dreams in Cuba. And so, I think that was the case for my father leaving Iran as well, and for many people.
Yeah. Well, Leo is very proud. Nassim feels shame, and they each have ulterior motives. I'm curious about developing these characters, because you focus more on Leo's point of view and not Nassim's. And I was sort of hoping you would alternate between the two of the characters, which is what a lot of romance novels do. But I think by telling the story through his eyes rather than hers, the twists in the narrative are more interesting. So can you talk about developing the characters and the sort of narrative structure of the film in that regard?
Yeah, we did actually consider, at one point we had the script kind of evenly split between the three protagonist eyes, but it just got a little bit heavy, and it's such a dense film in some ways. It's like dealing with race and politics and love and sex tourism and all this stuff, that if it started getting too many perspectives equally weighted, it started to just feel a bit heavy. And also, I wanted the film itself to reflect Leonardo's experience. So, when we switch to anamorphic lenses in Montreal, it's because it's got a shallower depth of field because Leonardo can't see things as clearly as he could in Cuba. And so, the idea of the marble it's Leonardo's destiny. So at a certain point, we just decided to make it be seen through Leonardo's eyes, but to try to get a sense of what all the other characters were feeling, and to really try to make a film where there's no real hero, where everybody does morally questionable stuff, but there's no bad guy really. There's no predator, and there's no one who's too naive. I think Nassim maybe seems naive when she first arrives in Cuba, but then she takes ownership of her decisions and isn't particularly naive at all.
See, I thought she had an agenda at one point early in the film, and of course that comes to bear fruit. But it's a very interesting dynamic and relationship, and I think that's part of why I wanted more from her, is because I sort of knew where she was going with some of this, but how naive was she and how calculated was she? But that's what kept me engaged: is when is this shoe going to drop? When is she going to figure out the truth, and how is it going to happen? You mentioned the marble, and I think that's a really great image, and I love that symbol in the film. There are also ideas of the tiles that Nassim admires, and she recreates stained glass, which I expected actually. The idea of the cat becoming a lion, which is a metaphor for Leo's transformation. Can you talk about creating symbols? Because I also want to get into the ideas of rituals and superstition, because I like that you open with orishas and include a bris. There are ideas of ritual culture in the film. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit, or have you talk about that.
Sure. Well, in terms of the symbols and the symbolism, it's actually, it's not something that I was trying to make these really clear symbols in a way, but that is totally what I did. But it's kind of and if you look at a Wong Kar-wai film like Happy Together, the snow globe.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Takes on all this weight, and it becomes kind of this avatar for the film itself. And so,
and your marble does that, and you have these great shots of the city upside down in them, or they're gorgeous.
Yeah, oh good. I'm glad you liked it. Yeah, it was fun because we were shooting. We had these huge macro lenses on this camera in Cuba, and everything's breaking all the time, and trying to get it to work. We had a big marble to shoot through, and a medium one, and then the one that you actually see is actually rather complex. But yeah, I guess I grew up with the stories of the Shahnameh, which is the kind of the Iranian epic poem of that was written by Ferdowsi, and it's mythology, and I love mythology in general. Yeah. And so I grew up with these kind of stories of for example, the bird at the end that you see in the stained glass, that's actually a simorg, which is kind of like a Persian phoenix, and there's something about coming back to life in there, and so it's not so much that I'm trying to make direct metaphors, but just kind of trying to make a whole substrate of richness that you can kind of bounce into and bounce out of as you're watching the film.
And it's funny because I thought that the bird in the end, obviously she was working on a piece and the eye was important, but I was like, what is that symbol? What does it mean? And I like looking at that because I find, I read a lot of literature, and I always, try and find, metaphors and symbols in art because I find them in my real life. And some of them are, in film, they're often heavy-handed. I didn't think that was the case here. And that's part of why I'm curious how you develop them. But I'm also interested, are you superstitious like Leo?
I think people would say that I am. I think the thing with religion, superstition, there's a very blurry line between the two, and I think that once you have faith in something, then it can balloon up. So, for example, I was initiated into Santeria, and so I have orishas in my house, and my wife would say that I'm very superstitious about them, but to me, I'm just kind of taking care of them. You know what I mean? It's kind of different ways of looking at things, or a circumcision in Judaism. From if you told someone who had no idea what that was, that people do that, they'd be like, "What? That is insane," But and kind of superstitious and weird. But if you're within the culture and your faith determines that you need to do that to have this covenant with God, then you do it. So yeah, I mean, I guess I believe that there's like one mountain and many paths to go up the mountain. I kind of believe that all religion. I believe in faith. I think faith is a beautiful thing. So in some ways I'm superstitious, and I guess, but it's more that I'm respectful of the symbols of people's faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's what I gravitate to is what is the meaning behind this, and what is the story? I mean, it's all about storytelling. What is the story behind this, and why is it important, and what can we learn from it, and how will it help us grow in our lives? Speaking of storytelling, let's talk about the music, because you said earlier you're a musician in your other job. The music was very interesting to me. How did you incorporate that in the film? Because I also want to talk about the dance and filming the dance and how dance should be represented in film. So let's talk about the music first, and then I'll ask you about the dance.
Sure. So I composed the music, which is something I'm quite proud of. They're crazy process, but I mean, I love lots of different kinds of music, and I felt like the kinds of music that you hear on the streets in Cuba right now is kind of like reparto and reggaeton and stuff. That needed to be. I mean, that's what Afro-Cuban people listen to, so that had to be in there. But there's also in Cuba, there's just so much respect for the musical traditions that led to where we are now. So I needed to include that because that's part of the richness of the culture. And then there's a lot of Iranian music. So those are the music that we licensed. Then the kind of main theme that is the overarching melodic theme of the film is from the song that the grandmother sings in the kitchen while she's cutting onions. And it's no me preguntes porque estoy triste. So don't ask me why I'm sad, because I'll never tell you. You shared your good times with me, or you shared my good times, but never the bad. Why is that? And so the crazy thing about that was that the woman who is playing the grandmother is quite a well-known actress in Cuba, and I'd heard she could sing. So we did all the takes, and I was like, just sing a song on this take. And then she sang that song, and I was like, okay,
perfect.
There's the key to the film. So then when we were doing the soundtrack, that melody comes back, in like these kind of like atmospheric cues, and then like in the house music scene, you hear that in the background, like that kind of that melody becomes the overarching idea of the film in a way, because it kind of speaks to the theme so well.
Yeah, no, I want to talk about the dance, as I said. The early scenes of the dancers in slow motion are gorgeous. There are a lot of vibrant scenes of Leo dancing with Nassim. There's a school of thought, of course, that dance should only be shot full frame, and yet many filmmakers often shoot dance in close-up. I want to talk about how you approached filming the dance, because I also like the way you shoot bodies in the film. Leo's seen in extreme close-up in Cuba. After he quits the ballet company. He's also seen in isolation in Montreal. I could accuse you of fetishizing his body a little bit with your camera, because he's just gorgeous. What were your decisions in terms of shooting dance and incorporating the dance in the film, but also shooting the bodies?
Yeah, I mean, there is a school of thought that you should just shoot that stuff wide frame, and I'm not interested in doing that at all. And I think generally, like, I work with a lot of dancers, like on dance films and music videos and whatever, and in general, they end up being super happy. At first, they're like, no, you need to see my feet the whole time. I'm like, well, no, I don't. Trust me, like, do that. When you do it live, people can see your whole body. That's great. But what we're doing here is it's a different art, And
we can see your emotion. I mean, if you feel good and you're concentrating on the performance, we don't need to see the feet, what they're doing, if we see the smile, if we see the intensity, if we see the passion.
Yeah. I mean, I think the kinetic power of a bead of sweat in close up flying off a face, that tells you more about the movement of the person than seeing their entire body, And Juan Pablo was actually really good at filming dance too, the cinematographer. But sometimes I would take the camera as well, just because I love it. Like, basically, I just dance with them, and especially once I know more or less what they're going to do, like, it becomes, we're dancing together. Especially when they're doing a solo, it can be really nice to like create this like secondary character for the dancer to connect with, rather than just like performing,
Yeah, and I thought a lot of the dance is poetry in motion. I mean, even when he's dancing with Nassim, you get the vibrancy of that moment. And I loved the slow motion in the beginning, because you got to see the bodies and their form and their expression, as opposed to if they moved at regular speed, it would be like, okay, he did a leap.
Yeah.
For Leo, did you cast a dancer who was an actor or an actor who was a dancer? I mean, you had to have worked with him on the role a little bit. He's very sexy. He's very charismatic. Um, you know, but I'm always wondering with non-professionals.
Yeah. No, good question. I mean, so Yona Acosta is actually one of the best ballet dancers in the world right now. He's the nephew of Carlos Acosta, who was considered the best dancer for many years. He was the principal at the London Ballet, and Yona is the principal. He was the principal of the English National Ballet, and now the Munich Staatsballet. So he's definitely a dancer who had to learn to act. And I knew it would be a challenge, but it also felt like a challenge I was way more willing to take than getting a good actor and trying to teach them how to do ballet in 3 months. Like with
Yes.
the thing about ballet is it's decades to get to a decent, level. And it informs every movement in your life. It definitely informs the way you walk, the way you stand. And so we would have needed
posture was incredible.
Well, exactly.
I wish I could have his posture.
Me too. But that's just how he stands. That was the thing is he was never acting when he was doing anything dance related. And I thought that was just so important.
But he projects such a confidence, and that's what makes him sexy and charismatic and appealing, is that he just owns the room. So when he has these fights with the teacher at the ballet school, or he, has a fight with his girlfriend, or he has a fight with Nassim, he's just so imposing as a figure because he's just upright. And it's great. I mean, what decisions did you make regarding the depictions of race in the film? I like how Leo perceives the racism in the Cuban Ballet Company, how he mocks the Montreal Company who wants exoticism. He's unaware of the racism expressed by Nassim's father. Eventually he finds work because he has the right look. Can you talk about that thread in your film? Because I think, with Afro-Cuban, there is a sort of a race component, and you explored it in a way that didn't hit you over the head with it, which I like.
Yeah. Well, that was really important. I mean, it was important to me, it was important to Pablo. We were actually originally looking for someone with darker skin, but we decided that we had to go with the best actor. Because even within, there's colorism within Afro-Cubans and in North America as well. But it was interesting, right now I live in New York City, and there's this very, clearly defined kind of race politics. And I think, and that's interesting, and there's a reason for it, and there's a whole history to the United States that's fascinating and horrifying. I think that there's sometimes a lack of knowledge within the United States that there's other forms of racism than what happens here, and that was something I wanted to show. There's racism everywhere in the world. There's racism in Cuba, and I wanted to show how it manifests in Cuba. And I also wanted to show, if you're a black dancer in Cuba, there's a bit of a ceiling because they learned, because it was under Soviet influence for so long, and it was people in Cuba were taught by Russians, which is why they're so good, because they have these Caribbean bodies, but they have this kind of raw power in the way that their bodies are constructed. But then they have this elegance and then this, finesse that they learned from the Russian system. But it's very rare that you'll see, and especially until recently, a lead dancer in in any kind of production in Cuba as an Afro-Cuban. So people escape Cuba to go, work at another company, and then all of a sudden it's the opposite. Then suddenly they're like Carlos Acosta, when he went to London, people call him the Cuban Missile. Talk about exotifying somebody. Yes. I'm sure it worked out well for him in a lot of ways, but it's also super gross. Let's get this hot Cuban black man to be our Romeo, and that
tokenism in a degree.
What's that?
It's tokenism to a degree.
Yeah, tokenism and exotification, and so I wanted to show the different. There's no singular experience for anybody, and there's also the lateral racism within the people of color, the Iranians are racist towards the darker Cubans, and I wanted to show that too. I want to just talk about race in a way that is not necessarily the conversation that we're having all the time in the United States.
But I think that the thin thread of it is very prominent because we do get the attitudes, and he feels persecuted in a lot of ways in Cuba, and he's not even aware of how he's being persecuted in Canada. What about, I mean, Iranian Jew is a really interesting, combination too, because they're obviously a minority in Iran and in the diaspora as well, I would think. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, at first we had a white Montreal lady who was going down, and I think it was actually just walking around. I don't know whether it was in New York or Montreal, but just seeing some mixed race couples. They're like, wait, why is the assumption that we should have a film about the other and then the us to have something relatable to, or whatever? Like the standard should be a white person. So I was like, okay, well, let's look at what kind of, what I know enough about, and also just like what kind of people go there. And there's actually, like, I think Iranians find Cuba really interesting because there's some similarities between Cuba and Iran.
Sure, sure.
And yeah, and so we just decided to go for it. And also, I mean, Iranians love seeing themselves on screen. I mean, I think everybody does, really, especially people who aren't depicted consistently in film. When you finally get to see yourself in a movie, it's like, okay, my story is valid, and that's feels good. And so for Iranian Jews in particular, there are a lot of Iranian Jews. They all live in LA and Queens, but
right.
But it's very rare that you see an Iranian Jew in a film. Yeah. Why is that? So I was like, well, why? I could have done it with a Turk or a Vietnamese lady. The story would have been as interesting, I think, but because I know Iranian Jewish culture well, and because it's people who aren't seen much in film, I decided to choose that.
No, I really appreciated that, because the film is not traditionally a Jewish story, and I want to talk about what it means to present your work at a Jewish film festival. You seemed surprised that so many Jewish film festivals are wanting to show this film, which isn't explicitly Jewish, but I think it's important to show the diaspora, and that's sort of,
yeah,
the benefit.
I think it's awesome. It's really like, it's, you never, as like, okay, it's going to be this like hit at Latin film festivals and dance film festivals, and then it's like a hit at Jewish film festivals, and that's great. Like it's finding an audience, and that's all we can hope for, really. But I'm struck by the openness of Jewish film festivals to showing a film that's not like, specifically Jewish, I guess. And it's cool, and I think it's probably. Yeah, I think it's probably rare that there's that many stories about Afro-Cubans at Jewish film festivals. So great,
Yeah, and I always go to a film festival to see something I wouldn't see otherwise, which is why this film appealed to me. It's something that it's like, well, I love Latin culture, so I wanted to see that represented. And Iranian Jewish culture, I'd never seen that represented. So, Kaveh, thank you so much for speaking to the Philadelphia Jewish Film and Media Festival and taking part in our program. For those out there who love the film, help spread the word by telling everyone you know that SIN LA HABANA is available to stream on demand now until the end of the Fall Festival on November 20th.
Thank you so much, Gabe. And thank you to the festival.